Would you please welcome Hall of Fame committee member, Mr. John Law.
Thanks, Craig. Well, thank goodness that Barry Cable over here and the officials at North recruited Jimmy Krakouer to play for the mighty Kangaroos, because that meant I never had to play against Jimmy. I would have hated having to compete against such a champion player who was tough, he was fast, he was fit, he was elusive and had impeccable disposal skills by hand and by foot. And apart from all that, even though I've done a little bit of boxing growing up in the bush, I still reckon I might have worn a few of Jimmy's left hooks too. Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, that was Jimmy, and it was great to have him as a teammate. I can remember going into the ABC television studios to be interviewed on the footy show The Winners, and fair dinkum, I thought I'd walked into the Jimmy and Phil Krakouer show. Everyone was fascinated by the way Jimmy and Phil played, and they all asked me about the incredible affinity the two brothers had, as if it was some magical power of communication. What they didn't realise was, because Jimmy was so tough, he won a lot of the ball. Because he was so elusive, he could break a tackle and find space. He was super fast, so he was able to break away and have ample time to steady and before kicking. And because he had fantastic peripheral vision, he would look for and spot Phil. And because his disposal skills were brilliant, his kick would be accurate and weighted perfectly. So Phil, who also had superb skills, well, he did the rest. Talent and a fierce desire to succeed, they were the magical ingredients of their affinity. Part of John Kennedy's assessment of a player's character was whether he'd want that player beside him in the trenches in the war. Well, Jimmy would be my first choice. I knew that Jimmy would never, ever let me down, particularly when the going got really rough and tough. Jimmy, you'll remember one day out here in the MCG, we were playing Richmond. Dale Waitman collected me a ripper just to the jaw, which rattled me a bit. And although I wasn't seeing too well, I did notice Jimmy heading Waitman's way and missed him by only centimetres. And I reckon Dale would have woken up the next day if Jimmy had connected. Jimmy apologised to me for years and years after that for missing out on the chance of evening up for me. I think Jimmy somehow felt that he'd really let me down. I said to the North Melbourne players a few weeks ago that shinboner spirit to me was all about looking after my teammates. And I said to them, you know, for about 3 seasons, the half-back line for North Melbourne was Greg Glendinning Law. Brownlow, just a hard nut. And I felt really an obligation to protect Keith and Ross from blokes who wanted to knock out a Brownlow medalist. But that feeling never, ever came anywhere near the immense feeling I had to protect Jimmy. Because Jimmy was such a champion, opposition players challenged him enormously, both physically and verbally. And what Jimmy had to cope with out on the field really made my blood boil. I would have run through a brick wall to help Jimmy. Problem was, Jimmy often sorted everything out for himself before I arrived. Jimmy was also one of the most dedicated trainers at the club. He never took any shortcuts. There were plenty of blokes back in the 80s who could count much faster than they could do push-ups or sit-ups. Not Jimmy. Jimmy would count every push-up accurately, even if it meant he finished well after everyone else. I've never ever felt sorry for an opposition player in my whole career, but the closest I've come is for the poor, bewildered opponents playing on Jimmy. I've seen Jimmy turn a less than 50-50 contested ball into a magnificent goal or a goal assist. Jimmy's brilliance was indeed absolutely bewildering. There are not many players from the 80s who could play well in today's footy, but Jimmy is one player that could. Jimmy had every skill and character trait that you would want in a modern day player. And I thought the Hawthorn match a few weeks ago was a blast from the 80s. I certainly wanted to jump the fence and give Spud and his teammates a bit of help on that night. And I know Jimmy would have had the same feeling. Now, Jimmy, you would have coped okay with the skill and the fitness levels required for that match. But I think we both would have had a lot of problems with those four umpires. Four umpires, Jimmy, trialled that night. And maybe all those cameras too that they didn't have back in the 80s. They might have caused us a few problems too, Jimmy. We talk a lot about shinboner spirit. Well, shinboner spirit to me is when you go into battle on the football field with someone for 8 years, playing 134 games together. And shinboner spirit is that immense feeling that you have for each other when confronting an opposition that wants to inflict physical and mental pain on your teammates. And that's a feeling you usually reserve for your immediate family. And shinboner spirit is when, some 18 years later, Jimmy, you still have that same feeling about protecting your teammate. Jimmy, most people in this room know you were a champion player, but only those lucky players from the 80s know what a fantastic teammate you were too. Well done and congratulations, Jimmy.